I will be talking tonight about religious literacy is or as social justice. I tinkered with that title for months and finally settled on is. And I want to say a few disclaimers at the top. So the first is that I want to give you a little bit about positionality. So positionality in my universe is where faculty orient themselves around their specialization so that you have a sense of what my stakes are in the conversation. So I identify as a cis het woman. I'm a mom, I am a Jewish lady, and I'm an expert on Islam. And so all of those things matter for how I talk about the fields of religion. The second disclaimer is that when I talk about religion, it is as a scholar. So when I'm talking as a Jewish person in my synagogue, that's a really different voice and a different hat that I wear as compared to when I speak as a PhD holding alleged expert or an expert, but I'm suspicious when folks claim that they are masters of something because there's always more to learn. What a PhD teaches you is that you don't know much. You could spend your whole life learning, which is kind of what I'm doing here. But when I speak as a religious studies expert, I am not asking you to think theologically with me. I am not telling you what the right way to be is in the world. I am not suggesting that your religious practice or irreligious practice or secular practice is correct. What I am asking us to do is to think about what religious people say, how we evaluate that within a historical, social, and cultural framework, and to see that religion as a concept is all around us. And so that might butt up against some theological concerns, like I tell my students, and that might challenge some of the theological traditions that we come from or secular traditions that we come from, because Vermont is, per Pew Research data, right, the least religious state in the Union, which I have questions about because the way you're measuring that, Pew religions, I've got a bit of a bone to pick. I say all of that because often when I do public lectures like this or talk with folks in the community, their first question is like, how did a nice Jewish girl, or I'm assuming that you'd think I'm nice, how did a nice Jewish girl from New York end up being a scholar of Islam? How does that happen? Are you a secret imam? Are you a secret Muslim? Is your Judaism compromised? Are you a secret rabbi? Like, you name it, those are the questions we get. But I think that brings us to our topic today, where we think about religious literacy, to be fluent about religions, plural, and religion as a broad cultural notion. Being religiously literate might help me get fewer of those questions, right? We might be less suspicious of me as a Jewish lady who studies Islam because it's historically interesting and culturally compelling if we were religiously literate and didn't assume that Jewish folks might not be interested in Islam, or that our interest in Islam might be nefarious or ignoble in some way. So those are my orientations, my self positions. And so hold those in mind if it makes sense as we go. And if not, it's always awkward to teach a class, even if it's just 1 hour with everybody where I'm a stranger and we're all strangers. So hopefully that just gives you a little bit more of who I am and what I hope to bring to the table. Shall we jump in? If we are talking religious literacy, I think an important thing is, well, what is religion? I usually, when I teach this in a classroom and we're not on Zoom and we can't have a cacophony of voices, would ask folks to shout it out and I'd write it on the board. And almost always we get the big religions. Folks will say Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. They will often ignore things like Zoroastrianism, Afro-Caribbean traditions like Voodoo, Sikhism, not Sikhism. That S-I-K-H word is Sikh, not Sikh. We might ignore those things. We might jokingly say, well, I don't know, something like it's dogma, or it's my mom's, or it's Sunday school I hated. But here are some pointers for us as we go on what I think religion is when we study it scholastically, and at a little bit of with our scholar hat on that doesn't assume objectivity, but is asking us to trace religion as a phenomena in history and in social settings. So one of my phrases, my favorite catchphrase when I teach, is that religion is what people do. Now that sounds really vague. and it bothers my students. And so if it's bothering you, good. It means I've got you interested. Religion is what people do, because it's not up to us as scholars to think about whether or not someone's beliefs are accurate. And religion isn't just belief, because when we think about religion as belief, we are prioritizing certain types of religion and certain types of religiosity. So for example, Judaism and Islam favor action over belief. Doesn't mean Jews and Muslims don't believe things. They do. They believe a lot of things. But the creedal piece of this, the declaring one's beliefs, is not a central part of either of these religions. Both of these religions, long and complicated and diverse histories, would say, cool, you're a believer, but what have you done lately? Have you done your prayers? Have you fulfilled the obligations important to you? So when we look at religion just through the lens of belief, we are already prioritizing, frankly, creedal religions, which in the West tend to be Christianity, and that worldview over and above other religions and what they value. Really famously, the question of whether a Jew must believe anything, and most rabbis have answered the question with like, not really. Your intention doesn't have to be full, wholesale, 100% belief, but you got to do what the books and what the law is telling you to do. So religion is what people do helps me organize how we approach religious people and religious communities, in addition to religious texts, religious ideas, ethical systems, morality systems, as I like to say to my students, out there in the wild. So it's not just belief. Religion is what people do. And unfortunately, we're already jumping into my area of expertise, which is religion as a notion. This word religion is a constructed definition with roots in imperialism. And not just any imperialism, but Euro-American white imperialism that is often rooted in Protestant Christianity. Now, that's a big claim. I am not claiming that all Protestants everywhere are imperialists. And I am not claiming that Christianity in and of itself is a problem, but the definition of religion started this idea that people are supposed to have religions, that some religions are good and other religions are not, and that to be a proper citizen, subject of a nation state or an empire relied on one's religiosity, and that one's religiosity was only filtered through particular lenses. That's a European empire thing. And that's a history that as white folk, we need to reckon with and we need to manage. And I am happy to talk until you are all blue in the face. Excuse me, because I'm never sick of talking of imperialism. It's where my books and research live. But I'm happy to talk about that more. But these are kind of my givens. Religion is what people do. So that means, as a Jewish person, just because someone does Judaism in a way that I don't, or that I don't agree with, doesn't mean that they are less of a Jew. That would be a theological premise. Maybe in my own synagogue, I would have that kind of comment. Maybe my rabbi would have that kind of comment of like, well, the way I would practice Judaism would be this. If you want to up your Jew credibility, you might do X, Y, and Z. But as scholars of religion, and while you're with me, you are a scholar of religion, we take seriously all religious people's claims to their own religiosity. If you're claimed by your religion, you're that religion. So that means we have to put the peace and love, hippy dippy religions in that claim Christianity in the same bucket that we put the Klan who claims Christianity. Our definition of religion, our approach to religion has to be flexible enough to be able to see both of those extremes on a spectrum as claiming Christian religiosity. All right. You're with me, I hope. What isn't religion, though? So what is religion? Religion is what people do. It's not always belief, and it's rooted in imperialism. What isn't religion? It's not absent from public or private life. It's just not. And we're going to talk a little bit as we move about law and about American culture, because Americans love claiming that there's this separation of church and state. This is my sarcastic face. No, sorry. We claim that there's a separation of church and state, but there really isn't. And we can trace that in American law. Religion isn't done with you, even if you're done with it. This is my favorite line in Vermont, because in Vermont, so many of my neighbors, my classmates, my colleagues do this thing of like, well, we're irreligious, we're spiritual, but not religious. I'm not interested in religion. I don't go to church. I don't go to synagogue. I don't go to mosque. And that's great. In the United States, though, if you're an atheist, religion is still not done with you, because religion, and particularly certain types of Christianity or certain types of Christian theory, is baked into our legal system. It's baked into our calendars. My favorite thing to do is to ask, when is winter and spring break? And they're usually around Christmas and Easter. So we can call it something secular, but it's not secular. It does not have a secular history. And it privileges folks who want Christmas off for their religious holiday. We do not have a Rosh Hashanah break. We do not have a Ramadan break. We do not have Ganesh's birthday break, right? So religion is not done with us, even if we are done with it. It is in, as I like to say, it's in the floorboards. It's just kind of in the air around us. And so my job, truly my job, is to get folks to see it, to pay attention to it. The other thing that religion isn't, which I'd never encountered really until I came to Vermont, was this like true animosity toward the word religion as this source of violence, hate, strife, war. No. People do those things. Some of those people are religious people, but religion on its own doesn't have arms and legs, right? Christianity can't do or say anything. Christians can. Islam can't do or say anything, but Muslims can. And so religion is as much culpable for hate and wars and strife as it is for liberation movements, feelings of freedom, theological systems that bring joy and peace and harmony, even to people whose lives are oppressed or victimized in other ways. So religion isn't just a punching bag, something we should blame. And so why do we care? I think my big question is always, so what? So like, okay, what is this egghead telling us about anything? One of my major points is that religion's always in the room. So we actually need how to know to address it, understand it, and see it. And not just theology. I think we're good at seeing when someone quotes the Bible, or when we talk about debates about the Pledge of Allegiance and whether or not under God should be in the Pledge of Allegiance. We're really good at, like, our spidey sense goes off and says, okay, that's religion. But religion is also, like, why do we have Saturday and Sunday off, but not Friday? Right? Muslims pray on Friday. Why is Friday not a flex day as opposed to not? Right? I'm not asking us to make that claim, but I want us to see how even when we go about our day, religion is right there. Why else should we care? Religion is inherently political. All things have a politic, and religion, in particular, the way it gets used and I'm going to focus us on the United States because that's where we live, but we need to know about it. We need to figure out how to understand it and how to approach it, because religion shows up in our politics as a rallying cry. It shows us in our politics as a scapegoat, and it shows up in our systems of engagement. We should also care because religion is used in liberatory and oppressive ways, conservative and liberal ways, complementary and contradictory ways. I think we need to be able to see beyond limited definitions like religion is text, or religion is belief, or religion means praying on a Sunday or sitting in a synagogue. I think we need to do better than that if we are going to get to the kinds of place where religious literacy can be a part of a social justice space, because we need to understand variety of religious experience. There's a variety of experience in our own religious traditions, and there are varieties of religious experiences for people of multiple backgrounds. And so that variety, we don't have to know it all. We don't have to be able to regurgitate facts about one denomination of Judaism versus another denomination of Judaism versus another denomination of Islam, right? I'm not looking for perfect knowledge. None of us have that capacity. But I am looking for us, frankly, as a scholar and as someone who takes seriously the ways in which religions are minoritized and racialized and how that leads to systemic oppression. I care a lot that we notice that variety and have the skill set to say, I didn't know that. Tell me more. Instead of, that doesn't seem legitimate. Let me shut it down. Or, sorry, this is the way we've always done things. Fit in. I think we can do better than that. We should also care because we live in a white, Christian-centric nation, which means that religion is always part of the story. It is in the Constitution. It is in our Bill of Rights. We claim that we care about religious freedom a lot, but often we mean religious freedom for some and not for all. And we've seen that legally in all sorts of ways until 3-4 weeks ago. We had a Muslim ban on the books. Until 3-4 weeks ago, we had discriminatory policies around whose religions are protected under free speech. We still have ongoing debates about whether or not, for example, water protectors of indigenous nations are allowed to protest against pipelines that run through native lands, right? If that's supposedly freedom of religion, why are those things devalued while we allow for the Hobby Lobby case, which says that employers with sincerely held beliefs do not need to provide health insurance because that health insurance might cover reproductive care for women. So religion is part of the way we think legally in this country. And what makes us interesting is that unlike most other modern nation states, religion is baked into our law. It is made special by the First Amendment. That's not true in other places. In other places, there are religion exceptions and laws, but religion is exceptional in the United States, which means it's kind of everywhere we go. So legally, ethically, and in terms of inclusion, religion, I would argue, is the fabric of the United States. So why do I care about religious literacy? I care a lot about religious literacy. I think that to be a fully formed citizen, you need to know what's going on in your nation state. So that includes knowing about other people's religions. It includes knowing about religions even if you don't care about religion. It includes being able to talk to your neighbors without derision. And it includes being able to figure out answers on your own without always making minoritized people do the answering for you. As a Jewish lady who studies Islam, I'm tired when folks ask me every year what Rosh Hashanah is. There's Google. Like, we carry these things in our pockets. You can figure that out. Being religiously literate isn't about spouting out random facts, but it is about having the sensitivity to think about whether or not our actions are as inclusive as they possibly can be, and whether or not our assumptions are rooted in something like bias, stereotypes, a history of white supremacy, or a history of favoring certain types of religions over others. But I have a better question than why religious literacy. And it's, what are the costs of religious illiteracy? Who do we allow to not know? Because the simple answer here is that we don't allow religious minorities to be uninformed about mainstream religion. My 7-year-old daughter knows the dates of Christmas, and she knows when Easter is roughly, and she knows what those holidays are. She is a Jewish child who cried this December because she had to explain what Hanukkah was and didn't want to talk about Santa anymore. Now, I'm not telling you that story to make it like, oh, woe is me, play the violin. But it's 2021, and I had the same stories as a child, and my dad's parents were arrested, literally, for breaking truancy laws in New York City when they did not send him to school on Yom Kippur. So this is a multi-generational experience, not necessarily of anti-Semitism, but of religious illiteracy. My child exists in a mainstream white Protestant space, and so has learned that Christmas is on December 25th. Her classmates, her teacher, her principal, her school calendar has not, even though it is 2021, accepted and accommodated that there is religious difference in those building spaces. And that's no shade. I love our public school. We had a long chat about it and everything has been rectified. But I want to point out that my child, as a white Jewish kid, is not afforded the luxury of being religiously illiterate. And we are relatively safe. We are safe people. We are white people. We are not threatened at the TSA line based on our religiosity. We are not accused of being improper American citizens at this point in history for our religious beliefs. But that's not true for everybody. This is from a protest this past fall. The sign says, "Every real Muslim is a jihadist." The shirt says, "Allah is Satan." And there's at the neck, this man's shirt has a dotted line and it says, "Cut along the dotted line." This man is hateful, and we should name that as such. But he's also a product of a community that allows him to be religiously illiterate. He has not had to learn about Muslims. He has not had to learn about Islam. And the bits that he has filtered through from all sorts of media in a post 9/11 universe is incredibly hateful and incredibly violent. He is allowed to not know, and God bless the First Amendment, he is allowed to hang out on a street corner and hold this hate speech up. And Muslim children are not allowed the same flexibility of religious illiteracy. They would not be able to be in a public school and not know what Christmas is based on loads of politics, but also based on survival. Religious literacy is survival for minoritized people. Simranjit Singh, who is a Sikh scholar, again, that's Sikh, S-I-K-H, the religion of Sikhi. He's a wonderful, phenomenal, internationally known scholar. So if you have a moment, you should look him up. He wrote a beautiful children's book called Fauja Singh Keeps Going. And he hosts a digital series about spiritual practice and anti-racism. So he's a guy you should know. But his line, when he came to UVM to talk about religious literacy as part of a program I was running, was that for men that look like him, for men that he describes as brown, beard-loving, turban-wearing, and quite hairy, religious literacy is not about like being ecumenical, and it's not about interfaith work. It is literally about survival for him and his family, because he has been assaulted for being a brown, beard-having, turban-wearing man. His babies, like little tiny babies, they're like 3 and 6, have been accosted and asked questions about their religion that are hostile at best and really racist at their core. These are his stories. My stories include things like being demanded that I understand Christian prayer, of having students pass me Bibles at the end of a semester so that I could get right with God, right? Religious literacy is often a survival skill for those of us who don't fit into a mainstream Protestant white normative space. And so that means that religious illiteracy is a privilege. So for me, religious literacy is social justice precisely because I want my neighbors to know who I am and what I am. I want my neighbors to maybe know something about me so that when an elected congressperson accuses Jews of having space lasers, it's both ridiculous and really frightening to people beyond Jews. I want people to know about religion and to have a capacity for religious literacy so that there's a curiosity about religious difference and not an accusational tone. Which is to say, religious literacy for many of us is survival. And I think if we all participate in it, there's a greater capacity for social justice movements that are intersectional with each other, right? In American legal history, one's race was often determined, of course, by skin color and paper bag testing and nation states. But it was also determined by religion. There are all sorts of really famous cases from the beginning of the 20th century where families from Lebanon asking to be citizens were determined to be white and therefore worthy of citizenship, or not white and therefore not worthy of citizenship, based on one thing and one thing only, and that was whether or not they were Muslim. Right? Because families from Lebanon might be Muslim and they might be Christian, and Christian families were afforded the luxury of citizenship, full protection under US law, and the Muslim families were not. So that question of basics here, knowing our history, understanding prejudice, understanding bias, it's baked into this question of religious literacy. And I'm going to be a nudge for a second. So the flyer for this event was this image. This is a Sikh man with a turban in a city that looks not American. Let's say that. It looks not American. Maybe it looks kind of like the West Coast, maybe because of those Spanish style roofs. And I'm not, I want to say out loud, I am not being mean to my hosts. I'm actually really grateful. This feels like a teaching moment for me. But this is the kind of image that goes along my flyers every time I give a talk. Every time I give a talk and someone selects an image, they select an image that looks like religion. And religion here is coded, or religious literacy is coded here as someone who is not white, who is wearing what my kids would call, when I talk about religious literacy at home, a funny hat. That other people's religions are the religions, as Clifford Geertz said, who's a famous scholar of anthropology of religion, are the religions of funny hats. Protestants do not have funny hats. The Pope very famously has a very funny hat. Jews have funny hats. Muslims have funny hats. Sikhs have funny hats. The religions of funny hats become a code for otherness. Now, I'm not, again, this is not a critique. I want you to hear this in like both jest and good-natured ribbing back, because this image and its flyer and whatever work that did to make all of you good people show up tonight is a really great example of where religious literacy and how we code that. We hear that as learning about not white, not Christian religions. We don't hear religious literacy as learning about Methodism or learning about Catholicism. We hear that as other. And I want to just point that out because I found it really interesting and I found it really instructive. Because if I have anything to impart, it's like for us to just check those questions as they come up for us around whose religion feels like we don't know anything about it. Who's the we there, right? Because Sikhs are demographically more numerous than Jews in the world. Muslims are roughly 25 to 28% of the global population. So when we don't know anything about them, it is what the cool kids say, a self-own. We're showing how little we know rather than how unknown our subject is. There's plenty of information there. We're choosing not to have access to it. So I want to say a few more things about religion and why religious literacy. Religion shapes our courts, our prisons, like whether or not you have access to halal or kosher food in a prison. And I've served on more of those cases than I care to admit in public, where like I have heard officials in prison systems say things like, well, Muslims can just have Jewish food, right? Like it's the same, there's no ham. And you're like, oh boy, okay. First Amendment clearly doesn't apply. It affects our economy, right? When we think of as high buying seasons versus not, who we trust with our finances and who we don't. It affects our law enforcement in terms of like literally the laws enforcement. Why are Native folks persecuted and prosecuted for obeying their own religious traditions versus not? It affects our popular culture, obviously, but it affects even our calendars. And as former Secretary of State and current presidential envoy of climate, he had a really long title now, John Kerry put it, quote, "We ignore the global impact of religion at our peril." So for me, religious literacy is about seeing how religion functions in our day-to-day lives, knowing enough to ask questions in respectful manners of others, but also to like, Google stuff. We've never had more information available to us. And I find that we have fewer and fewer excuses to be ignorant, right? And we have an obligation, I think, as folks who care, because we've shown up today, to think about how religious definition and the religions of not us are and are not privileged, persecuted, oppressed, derided, in public spaces. Now, everyone always tells me that I'm a stone cold bummer and killjoy, and I'm not that fun to be around. So let me end with a what can we do? So what can we do? And I'm more than happy to talk more about this. I am but one person, so I don't want to be solely responsible for thinking about activism or how do we make ourselves more religiously literate. The first thing is like, show up at talks like this. Congratulations, you already done step one. The second is to think about where are your points of entry? So for me, it's the school district. I have one kid in the school system. So it's little things like, can the interfaith calendar be part of the school's calendar? We don't have to do anything about it. You don't have to take Yom Kippur off or one of the Eids, like the end of Ramadan, for example. We don't have to take those holidays or those festivals off, but what kind of agency, what kind of allowance does it create if I see my own holiday on a calendar and can say to the principal, yeah, I'm taking that off today? Better yet, if the principal expects those calls because on his calendar, there's a holiday there, or her calendar, there's a holiday there. What would it look like if your point of entry is you schedule meetings? Are you scheduling meetings on days that might be holidays for people in your office? Are you, as a person who maybe is from a mainstream Protestant denomination, are you the person speaking up about those things rather than leaving it to the one or two religiously minoritized folks in your building? Because it's really exhausting to keep asking folks like Muslims to exist in spaces and to have to explain themselves over and over again, and then have to ask for what comes out looking like special privileges or special accommodations or special needs, when really the calendar already accommodates Christian needs. So you folks don't have to ask for it, right? So that's a really simple, like, what can you do? You can put it on your calendar. And if you know that there's folks in your office or in your community or in your card game that might celebrate something as opposed to something else, you can make those accommodations or offer those accommodations on your own. What else can you do? You can become more literate in terms of reading books. And I always have a book list that I'm happy to share with folks about mainstream publicly available books, particularly about Islam, but I keep a big long list of like global world religions that I'm happy to share with our hosts, and they can make available at the library. There are a lot of other things to do, but for me, it's when and where can you become part of the solution? Notice the privileges inherent in being perhaps of a Protestant background, or to feel empowered if you're not from a minoritized background to say, hey, I'm wondering if my school district, my office, my club can make these kinds of accommodations. Again, you can't do the work without doing the work, which is why I like to say that religious literacy, knowing something, isn't enough. most of this labor is labor. You need to put action to it. So I am from the universe where knowing something is part of the battle, but you also have to do something with it. And I like to harp on calendars because I think it's something we all play with every day. And now that most of us carry these evil rectangles around with us, we have some sense of our calendar more so than we might have in other generations. And so you can add that to your calendar, you can put it on repeat, and you can keep it in your mind in an easy way. Great. So let me stop sharing my screen so that I can actually see all of your faces. And then I can pop up the chat. Can I put his name in the chat? Oh, Connor has already gotten it. And I see that Tracy says that her non-religious Swedish exchange high school student has a better level of religious literacy than her religious children because they study religion in school. You're exactly right. America hates religion. It is the most funny thing ever because we are so religious as a group of people. Religion is everywhere you look in the States. When I travel, folks are like, oh boy, like how do you think religion isn't there? But religion's also one of those things that we decide is, my mom always introduces me as like, don't bring her to dinner parties because I only study religion and politics. So like I am not acceptable in public. And God bless my mom. My mom is consistently like, please, for the love of God, do not open your mouth at this dinner, or don't ask her any questions about her job. At one point, my mom at one point was like, tell them you study math. No one will have a follow-up question. Americans are allergic to the knowledge about other religions. When I was a teaching fellow at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, my advisor suggested that we study that the incoming first year book was the Quran. And boy, did the death threats pour in. Like not just protests, like death threats, all of us. It was my first experience with death threats. Not my last, my first, for suggesting that incoming college students learn something about the Quran, right? The holy text for Muslims. And so I think, Tracy, your comment really resonates with me. I think we're allergic to learning about these things, but it also comes from this place of fear and hate and discomfort. And this like overwhelming fear that we're always going to convert people. Gosh, are Americans worried that learning about something will then turn you to that thing? And Susan says in the chat that religion departments are being cut across the country at a time when religious education is more important than ever. Hear, hear. Yes, I'm currently in the religion department at the University of Vermont, which has made the national news for being on the slate of departments and majors that might not be funded moving forward as a cost-saving measure. Though how that saves money has not actually been made clear to many of us. And that's disconcerting. Incredibly disconcerting, right? I track hate crimes as part of my research, and we've had more hate crimes against religious minorities in the last 3 years than in any other 3-year period that they have ever been tracked, including after 9/11. So where we might have expected anti-Muslim and anti-Sikh hate crimes, because Americans like to switch up and like not pay attention and mistake Sikhs for Muslims. So we often lump Sikhs into anti-Muslim violence. We might have expected that in really high rates after 2001, but we have soared past those numbers in the last 3 years. Nancy asked, or says, I'm an English teacher of high school students. Where might I begin with helping students becoming more literate with religion and view it through a racial justice lens and a social justice lens as well? That's an awesome question, Nancy. So I'm happy to share this like list of books with you, but I'm curious about how much control you might have over your syllabi. I'm from a long line of public educators, so I have no idea what control you have over what books you teach, but I'm wondering if some of the novels you might teach might incorporate specifically religious themes. So some of the books I am thinking of are Moja, sorry, I'm going to type and talk. Let's see how well I do that. Moja Koff's book, especially Girl with the Tangerine Scarf. That's a book about American Muslims, and it has a lot of racial identity issues in it and is really excellent. My students, it's like a coming of age story, so students tend to love that. I teach that in a first year seminar, so I don't know how good of a high school book that would be. And then A Knight's Journey in particular, and I'm blanking on the author. Everyone just be embarrassed by me. Normally I'm a good walking bibliography, but I'm blanking on it. A Knight's Journey is a book specifically, it's YA fiction, Nancy, and it's about partition in India. And it's written like a diary. And it is from the perspective of a Muslim little girl who then is like kicked out of that. It's about how partition plays out. So when Muslims were sent to Pakistan and Hindus were sent to India, and it's really gripping and really like hard, but it gets at these issues of global understandings of religion and who belongs where and citizenship. I've got a lot of other suggestions, but I have a whole YA fiction list for my students. And I'm, again, happy to share, because then maybe if you do have control, that's a place you can start. There's 1,000 more, but my brain is going 1,000 miles a minute, which means my mouth isn't catching up. So let me end there. But I think really the way to do it is to draw on, and I'm pulling a lot from Muslim YA fiction because that's a space that I read a lot in. There's tons of stuff, particularly set for coming of age stories around high school students and the racialization of Islam. So what does it feel like to wear a hijab in high school? What does it feel like to be a Black Muslim in a time of police surveillance in mosques? There's a lot of novels around that I imagine would be great conversation starters. And a lot of authors like Moja Kaf have, I don't want to say teaching editions, but like questions for discussion at the back of the book that are always really helpful for folks when you're not in your realm of expertise. So, I will absolutely email y'all with that list, and you can distribute that to your people. And I try to do my best on those lists of what is available in public libraries, because I know that we don't all have access to university libraries or whatever. So I'll do my best to double check that before I send that out, to just make sure that those are titles that are available.
Send that to me. And then anybody that wants it, just email me, wendyh@brownowlibrary.org, and I can pass it along when I get it.
Thanks, Wendy.
Yes. And somebody circled back to how would you go about teaching religious literacy in a Christian school?
It's a really good question. I want to preface with, I don't know. This is going to be a shot in the dark. Again, as a Jewish lady who studies Islam, Christian school is out of my realm of comfort. But I'm curious about whether some of religious literacy in a Christian school would need to be some of the work of anti-racism, if some of that work would need to be about how historically many white Christians were engaged in the religious prosecution and persecution of others, and a reckoning with that before we also talk about what are the beliefs of others. Because I think one of the things that I have struggled with in my career is that students, but I'm going to say adults, students are actually way better at this. Young folk are better at this than grownups. We grownups are a little bit more set in our ways, but grownups tend to do, instead of comparative religion, like I am coming from one tradition and I want to explore another tradition on its own merits, grownups tend to do competitive religion. And that might be unavoidable in a school that has a religious mission where one religion always comes out the winner. And I think that's the wrong way to do religious literacy. Like, religious literacy done wrong is not those Muslims believe in God, but they do it wrong. And I've seen that all the time in religious literacy conversations. That's a big nope from me, because that's not really literacy. That's supremacy, right? I'm learning about you to be able to prove you wrong better, or I'm learning about you as like a nod or a hat tip, but I'm not trying to understand you on your own terms or with your own rich histories in mind. So I think competitive religion would be the thing I avoid. And the thing I might prioritize are some of those really hard questions. What do we do about Christian roles in the forcible conversion of Native Americans and the removal of Native Americans from their families? Like, what do we do with that? How do we deal with the forced conversion of enslaved Africans because that was thought to help them be better? And I don't think any of those conversations are good, but I do think all those conversations are necessary. I have a message that says, can I recommend a comparative religion text appropriate for YA collections? Oof. Not really. And a lot of those textbooks are bad. So Betty, it's a great question, but I do recommend there's a series at UNC Press that's for a mainstream audience that's like, who is Allah? What is veiling? What is the Quran? Those are great. And I think the series, I don't remember if it's short little introductions or just short introductions. Those are great too, but they're freestanding. So like it's a very short introduction to Buddhism, to Taoism, to Sikhism, and they're teeny and they're cheap. Those are really easy to read. They're meant for a mass audience. I think they're written at like an 8th to 10th grade level. The last time I sort of did a deep dive in that series, I can't think of one good all-purpose book at that level. That's a really good question. And if I think of one, I'll circle back. I'll put it on this list I'm sending Wendy. And I have a question that says, how do I manage, or how do you manage to reach people who are a part of religions that say our way is the right way, and if you don't follow or believe, then you are not fit to be part of our society? How do I personally deal with that? Is I don't. I have truly taken the tack that folks who show up to my classes, who show up to my public lectures, are here to learn and are curious. And I have long since stopped arguing with people who just want to fight me, because it's not a good faith conversation. I actually think that there are far fewer people who are adamant that their way is the right way and you can either convert or die. I think there are loads of people like that, but for the most part, those folks, in my experience, are kind of either sticking to themselves or they're fighting it out in court. So what I actually want is like a collection of progressive people who are like, you can have your religion, but you can't give it to me also. Like, keep it. Don't get it on me. Which is, I don't want to make that a non-answer, but I have learned for my own mental health and frankly for my own safety to stop arguing with extremists. And so your mileage may vary. I will also say the other thing that I am willing to do that I'm not willing to do in public settings is that, like, I work on my people, right? So the folks that are in my own community, whether those are my family members or like extended family members or members of my congregation, those are the folks I'm willing to call to account within the confines of that community space. I am truly not willing anymore, because it's resulted in death threats, to engage with extremists who are not willing to engage with me in a fair conversation, which I hope doesn't sound like a cop-out to that question. And I know that the question was asked by someone who's identifying as a Unitarian Universalist, which is a very inclusive religion. And so maybe your opinion would vary from that, but as someone who has been on the receiving end simply for giving talks like this of like really horrific hate speech and hate acts and threats, my space is not to engage those conversations anymore. My space is to engage with folks who want to know and do better, because I actually think that at the end of the day, the good wins. And so you just need better coalitions with the willing instead of the unwilling. And then Susan says that she taught liberation theology last semester and made use of several movies that really engaged the students: Romero, Gandhi, and The Long Walk to Freedom. Absolutely. They made lessons come to life. Absolutely. I've got films on that list too. Don't think I've left you hanging. I think some really great ones that work well in classrooms include New Muslim Cool, which is like an oldie but goodie at this point, but it's a documentary of a Puerto Rican convert to Islam who's also a rapper about Islam and the struggles his community faces as a racialized minority. They're heavily policed. Like half of the movie is about this police raid that happens in their mosque during prayer. But it's also this really faithful thing where he's engaging with all of his identities. And then there's The Feeling of Being Watched, which is a 2018 documentary about communities in Chicago, I believe, and what it is how Muslims experience surveillance in their spaces. And so I think all of these are really, I think films are really important. There's a question here asking if there's no books that emphasize commonalities between religions, the actions I spoke of earlier on, not about violence and hatred, on not doing unto others as you would be done by. There are books that emphasize commonalities. I'm thinking. None are coming to mind right away. Here's why. I don't think religious literacy is smoothing out our differences. Colorblind racism is still racism, right? Like religions are different. They're not just all paths up the same hill for most religious people. And so I'm often suspicious of books that seek to flatten out religious difference as if they're no big deal, when like most religious people in religious traditions actually find them to be compelling, right? There's a reason I'm a Jewish person and not a Christian person. I find my religion compelling. And so I can't think of any of those offhand, Kate, but I also want to just say that those make me a little bit uncomfortable. I want to understand religions in their own terms and in their own contexts, rather only in relationship to each other, because I think flattening out difference isn't the kind of literacy that I'm after. I think acknowledging difference and celebrating difference and allowing for difference rather than just pointing out sames. Oh, I see Tracy's hand up.
Thank you. I have a husband who is a teacher, a high school teacher. And as we're talking about this, one of the things that comes to mind is the conversation about racial injustice that we've been having sort of statewide, but certainly at our high school. And, many of our high schools, our high school students are leading that conversation. And so I guess I would ask, you, because one of the concerns I have, so often many of our teachers feel like they are unprepared to have a racial conversation. And many of them, I suggest, would also feel unprepared to have religious conversations, right? And how do you manage this religion literacy in that space? But, my concern is where the Black Lives Matter movement may or may not be also a springboard for a larger understanding about diversity. And as you mentioned, not seeing this through a lens of color blindness, not seeing this from a lens of sameness, but genuinely seeing this as a richness in the diversity. And, I guess my question would be then, what parts of certainly this racial conversation, certainly spearheaded by Black Lives Matter, what elements of that conversation might we be able to bring forth into a religious literacy conversation in such a way that we can say it is about really seeing the diversity here and identifying those differences. And, I also know that this is a challenge to all of us. This is in the history of the world. This has not been done well over time. But I'm just trying to, figure out as we're having that Black Lives Matter conversations, what lessons might we be able to apply to this as well?
Yeah, Tracy, that's a great question. And I think you're spot on. I think that what Black Lives Matter is doing is ultimately asking us to think first and foremost about Black folk. But if I'm honest, and here I'm going to be a little eggheady, but scholars of race are often scholars of religion, because in this country, those were interchangeable for quite a long time. So scholar of Black religions, Judith Weisenfeld, has a phrase that she calls religio-racial. And she never talks about Black folk without talking about religion also. And so what I have learned from those conversations, and what I've learned as an Islamic studies scholar, is that I'm never not talking about race. My whole books are about race. And Tracy's recommending the Black church. Absolutely. Judith was in that. Like, all of these scholars of religion are part of that conversation, precisely because race movements, liberation movements start in churches and mosques, right? Like, we cannot talk about Black Lives Matter and the positionality of that fierce demand for the end of white supremacy without frankly talking about people like Malcolm X, who we are historically really bad at talking about, because we're really bad at talking about Islam. And we're really bad at talking about the kind of Islam that Malcolm X comes from and represents. So Tracy, I guess I'm saying, I want to both like honor your sense that Black Lives Matter should be brought into spaces where we're also talking about all sorts of kinds of diversity. I see Black Lives Matter as an inherently intersectional movement where I don't think religion has been absent from those conversations at all. Many of the leaders of that movement, not founders, but leaders of that movement, are Black Muslims. And I think that the racialization of brown Muslims, right? So the ways in which we police brown people and the ways in which we police women who wear hijab, all of that is tied up not just in religion. It's not about whether or not that woman believes in her piety. It's about whether or not people see her as a threat, as a suspicion, as a citizen. So I want you to know that folks like me have been working with educators in limited and in broad ways for years, and that there are active grant proposals to do things like to like work with educators to write syllabi. I'm calling them syllabi, but to like write modules. So like, okay, you're doing a Black History Month unit. Can I give you the lesson plan that you might need for an English class at high school to do these books about Black Muslims? Can I help the social studies teachers talk about the history of Black Islam that's really important in suffrage movements in the early 20th century? Because I have that expertise. I've had the luxury of having that expertise. How can I do that in more public ways? And there are folks across the country doing this work. So Edward Curtis IV in particular, out of Indiana University, runs a summer session every year for public school teachers. I think it's 7th through 12th grade, though I'm not sure if I'm completely clear on that, or my memory's right on that. Fully paid, like it's free. You get a stipend to be there. It's selective, but like his whole program is, how can I in 4 weeks give educators in middle and high school grades enough information about Islam to do something with it in their classrooms? Not everything, but something. So yeah, I urge you to continue those conversations. And I want to take one more question, if that's okay, Wendy. Do we have time?
Yep.
So Reg asked again or said that I can't duck the issue of extremist positions when we have had a president who criminalized being Muslim, and the illogic of his followers is evident, as his people smashing into the Capitol and beating a police officer. Yeah, I don't ignore this at all. Like, for real, my whole career is hate these days. That's all I write about, is white supremacy and white Christian nationalism. I'm not interested in debating those people, though. I am interested in deplatforming them, and I'm fully interested in them losing power, because their power is dangerous to me and my people. And I don't say that lightly. Like, that's not a joke. That's not like a cancel culture woke young person moment. I get Nazi paraphernalia at my home regularly, because these people do not like that I exist, and they do not like that I write about Islam, and they do not like that I write about Islam in public ways, and I do not like that I'm a Jewish lady who seems friendly to Muslims. So my position on these extremists is not that I don't engage with them or that I don't engage their ideas or their ideologies, but I do not play with these bros because they are dangerous, and they are dangerous expressly to people like me. And I'm protected as a white person. Like, I can go about my day. I can choose not to do events like this and folks would leave me alone. But I do agree with you that we can't ignore those positions. And I suggest, I would urge you, there's a new book coming out, I think in a week from now, by Anthea Butler, who's on CNN all the time or MSNBC all the time. She's an amazing scholar of Black history at UPenn. Excuse me. And she's a brand new book coming out called White Evangelical Racism. And it's all about this movement and how things like QAnon and Trump supporters are capitalizing on 400 years of race and religious hate. So I think there are folks doing it better than me. I don't want to claim to be awesome when I'm just mediocre, but I want to be clear that I don't shy away from these issues, but I absolutely am not here to debate people who fundamentally debate my humanity. That's not a conversation. That's murderous. So I feel myself getting worked up because when I talk about the Nazis and the white Christian nationalists who are making threats against my children sometimes, I get a little bit feisty and a little bit anxious. So I hope you don't feel me as pugnacious, but I want to be clear that these conversations that they're happening, and I am actively part of them. I urge you all to be part of them too, but I'm not sure I can change those folks' minds. And I'm not sure I want to be asked to prove either my humanity or the humanity of the subjects I work with. I don't want to prove that Muslims are people. If I have to prove that, the person I'm talking with isn't worthy of my time. And that's just me, but yeah, and I'm putting Anthea Butler, Lori, in the chat. It's a new book called White Evangelical Racism. I always feel like when I'm typing in the chat, it's like watching me write on the board, and I always spell everything wrong. So I apologize for the typos. And Nancy wrote, thank you for mentioning Indigenous people. Your first job was on a reservation. You've seen firsthand the discrimination you mentioned and had heard stories from Lakota of their experience. Yeah, well, thank you for noticing that or acknowledging that and sharing that story. I guess the take-home message is religious literacy, we can all do better, and religious illiteracy is a luxury for some, and I don't think it's something we should be willing to afford anymore. We should be willing to put that down.